My name is Sam, and this is the story of a road trip I'll never forget. It all started on a quiet afternoon when my friends and I decided to drive out to an old cabin in the woods for the weekend. The road was long, and the trees around us seemed to get taller the deeper we went. There were 4 of us, me, Tom, Lisa, and Jenny. We were laughing and playing music, excited for a fun trip. As we drove further into the forest, the sky started to darken. The GPS lost signal and the road became narrower. We didn't worry at first. Tom said he remembered the way, so we kept going. Soon, we noticed something strange. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs of life. Just the road and the trees. It felt like we were the only people in the world. Suddenly, the car hit something. We stopped, thinking it was an animal, but when we got out, there was nothing there. Just an empty road. The air felt colder, and we all started to feel uneasy. Tom tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was nervous. We decided to keep driving. After what felt like hours, we saw a small gas station up ahead. It looked old and run down, but we needed directions, so we stopped. Inside, the place was empty, except for an old man sitting behind the counter. His eyes were wide and unfriendly. He didn't say anything, just stared at us as we asked for help. "Turn back," he finally said in a low, shaky voice. "There's nothing good down that road." We exchanged confused glances, but Tom thanked him and we left. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the old man still staring at us through the window. His words echoed in my head, "There's nothing good down that road." The night grew darker, and the trees seemed to close in around us. The road twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the forest. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. We were stranded, miles from anywhere, with no signal on our phones. As we sat in the dark, strange noises came from the woods. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and soft whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Jenny swore she saw something moving between the trees, but when we looked, there was nothing. We decided to wait in the car until morning, hoping someone would pass by. But as the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder. Then, out of nowhere, a soft knock came from the back window. We froze. Slowly, Tom turned on the flashlight and shined it outside. Nothing, just the trees and the dark. But then, we heard it again, a soft, deliberate knock, this time from the front of the car. My heart was pounding as I looked through the windshield. Standing in the road, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, was a figure. Tall, thin, and motionless. It just stood there, staring at us. We locked the doors and tried to stay quiet, but the figure didn't move. It just watched us. Minutes passed like hours, and then, without warning, it vanished into the trees. We didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, we were relieved to see the road again. But the car still wouldn't start, so we decided to walk back to the gas station. As we walked, the feeling of being watched never left us. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made us jump. When we finally reached the gas station, it was gone. The building, the old man, everything. There was just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, as if it had been abandoned for years. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes when I drive alone at night, I feel the same cold chill, and I wonder if something is still watching, waiting in the darkness. My name is Jake, and this story happened last summer when I went on a road trip with my girlfriend Emily. We were driving across the country, taking back roads to avoid traffic and see some new places. It was supposed to be fun, but one night changed everything. We had been driving all day, and as the sun started to set, we realized we hadn't passed a town or gas station for hours. The road was deserted, and our gas gauge was getting low. The trees along the side of the road seemed thicker, darker, and more twisted as we kept going. We figured we'd have to stop soon. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight disappeared, we saw a sign, "Welcome to Cold Creek." It was a small town, but at that point, we were just relieved to see civilization again. We drove into town, looking for a place to stay the night. The streets were empty, and most of the buildings looked old, almost abandoned. The only place that seemed open was a small motel at the edge of town. The sign flickered as we pulled in, "Cold Creek Inn." It looked run down, but we didn't have much choice. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit with a strange, musty smell. An old man stood behind the desk, his eyes cloudy and distant. He barely looked at us as he handed over a key and said, "Room 7. The room wasn't much better, old furniture, dusty curtains, and a creaky bed, but we were tired, so we decided to just rest for the night and leave first thing in the morning. After a quick shower, we got into bed, but neither of us could shake the uneasy feeling we had. Around midnight, we heard it, a soft tapping at the window. It was so quiet at first, I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Emily sat up, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. My heart started racing as the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I got out of bed and crept toward the window, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot and the dark trees in the distance. I closed the curtains and told Emily it was probably just a tree branch or an animal. But deep down, I wasn't sure. We tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping started again, louder than before. It was no longer coming from the window, but from the door. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. Emily was shaking now, gripping the blanket as the tapping grew more urgent, as if something was trying to get in. Gathering my courage, I walked to the door and opened it. No one was there. The hallway was empty. I was about to shut the door when I noticed something strange on the floor. A small piece of paper, folded in half. I picked it up and opened it, my hands trembling. The note said, "Leave before it finds you." I slammed the door and locked it, trying to stay calm, but Emily had already packed up her things. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. We grabbed our bags and rushed out to the car, but as we stepped into the parking lot, we saw something moving near the trees. A figure, tall and thin, just standing there watching us. Its face was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. We jumped into the car and sped out of the parking lot, not caring which way we went, as long as it was away from that town. As we drove, the figure stayed in my rearview mirror, watching us, standing perfectly still at the edge of the road. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, miles away. By the time we found another place to stay, the sun was rising and we felt safer. But something about Cold Creek haunted us. When we tried to look it up later, there was no record of the town. It was as if it didn't exist. To this day, I don't know what was tapping at our window, or what the figure was, but one thing's for sure, I'll never take another back road again. My name is Rachel, and if you're reading this, then I need you to believe me. I know it sounds crazy, and maybe I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it, but something is out there. Something on the highways, waiting for people like me, people who think they're just taking a shortcut. This is the story of my road trip that should have been a simple drive, but became a nightmare I'm not sure I'll ever wake from. It all started 2 summers ago when my boyfriend Mark and I decided to take a trip down to the coast. We were planning on spending a few days at the beach, enjoying the sun, swimming, and just getting away from the chaos of the city. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, about 6 hours, mostly along the main highway, with a few scenic detours. We started out in the early morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was cool and everything seemed perfect. We had snacks in the car, music playing, and the whole day ahead of us. Mark was behind the wheel, and I was scrolling through my phone, looking at places we could stop along the way. There was this one stretch of highway that I had heard about online, a scenic back road that supposedly had some beautiful views. It was a little out of the way, but I thought it would be worth it to make the drive more interesting. I mentioned it to Mark and he was on board. "Sure," he said with a grin. "Why not? Let's take the scenic route." We turned off the main highway onto a smaller, less traveled road. At first, it was everything we had hoped for. The road wound through rolling hills. Fields of tall grass swayed in the breeze, and the sun cast a golden glow over everything. We stopped a couple of times to take photos and stretch our legs. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was no one else on the road. No cars, no people, not even a house or gas station in sight. But we didn't think much of it. After all, it was the middle of nowhere. As we drove further, the road began to change. The smooth asphalt became cracked and uneven, and the scenery started to feel off. The hills became steeper, the trees thicker, casting long shadows over the road even though it was still early afternoon. There were no more open fields, just dense woods on either side of the highway, the branches overhead forming a tunnel of darkness. The feeling of isolation grew stronger, and the more we drove, the more it felt like we were being swallowed by the forest. "I don't remember this part being on the map," I said, pulling it up on my phone, but there was no signal. "Maybe we missed a turn?" Mark suggested, but his voice didn't sound confident. We hadn't seen any road signs for miles. The highway was unmarked, and it seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us, the trees pressing in closer and closer. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to admit it. Mark was still calm, but I could tell by the way his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter that he was starting to get nervous too. After another hour of driving, we came across a gas station, a small, old-fashioned one that looked like it had been there for decades. It was the first sign of life we had seen in hours, and even though it looked run down, we decided to stop. We needed to get our bearings, and, frankly, I needed to use the bathroom. As we pulled in, I noticed something strange. There were a few cars parked out front, but they were all old, like from the 1970s or 80s. The paint was faded, the tires flat, and the windows were covered in dust. It looked like they hadn't been driven in years. The gas station itself wasn't in much better shape. The sign was faded, and the windows were so dirty that you couldn't see inside. Mark parked the car, and we both got out. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and something else, something metallic and stale. There was an unsettling stillness about the place, like the world had forgotten it. But we were there, and we didn't really have a choice. We needed directions. Inside, the gas station was just as creepy as it looked from the outside. The shelves were half empty, filled with dusty cans of soup and old candy bars. There was a man behind the counter, but he didn't seem to notice us at first. He was staring down at something, his back hunched over as if he hadn't moved in a long time. When we approached, he slowly looked up, and his eyes were odd. They were glazed over, like he wasn't fully there. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "Yeah, we're a bit lost," Mark said. "We were looking for the highway back to the coast, but I think we took a wrong turn somewhere." The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at us for a long moment, like he was trying to figure something out. Then finally he pointed toward the door. "Keep driving," he said. "Stay on this road. Don't turn off, don't stop. Not until you get to the crossroads." "The crossroads?" I asked, confused. He nodded. "You'll know it when you see it. But whatever you do, don't take the left fork. It'll take you somewhere you don't want to go." I felt a shiver run down my spine at the way he said it, like he was warning us about something more than just a bad road. Mark thanked him, and we left, both of us feeling uneasy. The man's words echoed in my head, "Don't take the left fork." We got back in the car, and Mark started driving again. The road ahead was the same as before, narrow, winding, and surrounded by trees. The further we went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't just the trees anymore. There was something out there, something in the woods, keeping pace with us. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, too fast to be animals. The tension in the car was thick. Mark hadn't said much since we left the gas station, and I could tell he was just as on edge as I was. After what felt like hours, we reached the crossroads. Just like the man at the gas station had said, there were two roads, one that continued straight and another that branched off to the left. The left fork disappeared into the thick trees, and there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It looked darker, more foreboding, like the trees themselves were trying to swallow it whole. Mark slowed down as we approached the crossroads. "Do you think we should just keep going straight?" he asked, his voice tense. I nodded. "Yeah, let's stick to what the guy said." But as we passed the left fork, something strange happened. The car's engine sputtered, and the radio, which had been off, suddenly crackled to life. It was just static at first, but then faintly I heard a voice. It was soft, like a whisper, but I could make out the words, "Turn back." I froze. "Did you hear that?" Mark looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" "The radio," I said, pointing at the dashboard. But the static was gone, and the radio was silent. Mark shook his head. "I didn't hear anything." I tried to brush it off. telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, like a weight pressing down on us. We kept driving, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. There were no signs, no landmarks, just the endless trees and the sense that we were being followed. Then, out of nowhere, we saw headlights behind us. Another car. At first, I was relieved. Maybe we weren't alone after all. But as the car got closer, I realized something was off. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding, and the car didn't seem to slow down. It was coming up fast, way too fast. "Mark, that car," I started, but before I could finish, the other car swerved into the opposite lane and shot past us, so close that I could see the driver's face. Or rather, I couldn't. The windows were tinted, and the car itself was old, an old model I hadn't seen in years, like something from the 1960s. It sped past us and disappeared into the distance, but the moment it did, the air around us changed. It was colder, and the trees seemed even darker, their branches almost clawing at the car as we passed. "What the hell was that?" Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But I think we should turn back." Mark hesitated, but then he nodded. "Yeah, something's not right." He slowed the car and tried to turn around, but as soon as we did, the engine sputtered again, and the car died. The headlights flickered off, and we were plunged into darkness. Mark tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. "Great," he muttered. "Now what?" We sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But then, from somewhere far off, I heard it again. The same whispering voice from the radio, only this time it was louder. "Turn back. Turn back before it's too late." I grabbed Mark's arm. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I hear it." Before either of us could react, there was a loud thud on the roof of the car. It was followed by a scraping sound, like something was dragging its nails across the metal. My heart raced, and I could feel Mark tense beside me. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The scraping sound continued, growing louder and more frantic, like whatever was on the roof was trying to get inside. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, Mark reached for the door handle. "Don't," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Don't get out." But Mark shook his head. "We can't just sit here." He opened the door and stepped out, the flashlight on his phone illuminating the ground. I watched as he circled around to the front of the car, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Mark?" I called out, my voice trembling. But he didn't answer. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. "Mark?" I called again, louder this time. Still no answer. I walked around the front of the car, my hands shaking as I held up the flashlight, but Mark was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere, just the empty road and the dense trees surrounding us. "Mark!" I screamed, panic rising in my throat. But the only answer was the wind and the distant whispering voice, growing louder and more insistent. "Turn back. Turn back before it finds you." I didn't wait to find out what it was. I jumped back into the car, locked the doors, and tried the ignition again. This time, miraculously, the engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the road, the trees blurring past me as I drove faster and faster, my heart racing. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the next town, miles away. By the time I pulled into a gas station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat there in the car, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But none of it made sense. Mark was gone, and I had no idea where he was. The police searched the area, but they never found him. No one could explain what happened, and eventually, they gave up. But I know what I saw. I know that something is out there, on that highway, waiting for people like us. And if you ever find yourself driving down a deserted road with no signal and no signs, turn back. Before it finds you,